News of the success of the British cavalry against their French counterparts at the Battle of Coruna had focused Napoleon's attention on the British army in northwestern Spain. On the 23rd of December 1808, Sir John Moore, the British commander, had learnt that Napoleon was moving north in an attempt to trap the British army. He cancelled his planned advance towards Marshal Soult and began the army's retreat westwards towards Portugal. Moore deployed the British cavalry and the infantry of the Light Brigade as a rearguard to cover the army's retreat, which began on the 25th of December. The British rearguard soon became engaged in a series of small skirmishes. This included defeating the French cavalry at Beneventi. On reaching Astorga, Moore was joined by General Romana, commanding the remnants of Blake's Spanish forces. Romana proposed that they make a stand and fight. However, with Napoleon closing in, Moore declined and continued his retreat north, while Romana went westwards towards Portugal. Napoleon made an attempt to cut off Moore's retreat into Portugal and force him to battle. He led his army 200 miles in just over 10 days, by forced marches and in spite of appalling weather conditions, to reach Astorga on January the 1st with 80,000 men. However, Moore had already planned that he would have to retreat to the Spanish coast at Vigo. Leaving Astorga on December the 30th, Moore managed to keep ahead of the pursuing French and avoid a major battle. When it was clear that he could not bring Moore to battle, Napoleon left the pursuit of the British to Marshal Soult, with Marshal Ney in support, and took the bulk of the army, some 45,000 men, back to Madrid. As the retreat passed over hazardous mountain terrain, in harsh and bitter conditions of cold, ice and snow, men and horses from both sides began to suffer from exhaustion and privation. Several times during the retreat, the discipline of the British army dissolved. Hundreds of British soldiers got so drunk that they had to be left behind, to be either captured or killed by the pursuing French cavalry. Moore decided to make a stand before the town of Lugo on the 6th of January, but Soult's forces were initially too strung out. However, by the 8th of January, Soult was prepared for battle, but Moore, fearing that Ney was outflanking him, slipped away during the night. Realising he could not get to Vigo, and fearing that his army would disintegrate on the way, Moore ordered the transport ships to Batandos Bay between Coruna and Ferrol and headed towards Coruna. On the 11th of January, the main body of the British army finally reached the port of Coruna. During the retreat, they had lost 5,000 men. On reaching Coruna, the British had hoped to find the fleet to take them back to England. However, they found Batandos Bay empty, with only 26 transport ships, 2 warships and some hospital ships at Coruna. The British fleet of 245 ships had been delayed from England by unfavourable winds, and arrived at Vigo on the 8th of January and did not depart for Coruna until the 13th. In Coruna, the British discovered a large quantity of badly needed provisions, including military supplies of new muskets, cartridges and Spanish artillery pieces. There was also vast amounts of food, shoes and other supplies. The British were now rearmed, rested and fed, in a marked contrast to the oncoming French. The French army began to arrive the next day. Soult's infantry had trouble keeping up, and most were some distance behind the cavalry. The French artillery arrived on the 14th of January. The long-awaited British fleet also arrived on the 14th. That evening, the British began to evacuate their sick. Also, most of their guns, gunners, cavalrymen and a few healthy horses. but slaughtered some 2,000 cavalry horses. At the start of the battle, both forces were evenly matched. The British had approximately 16,000 men, consisting of 15,000 infantry and between 9 to 12 guns. The French also had approximately 16,000 men, consisting of 12,000 infantry, 3,200 cavalry and 20 guns. Moore deployed the main portion of the British Army to cover the evacuation on a ridge across the road about 1.5 miles south of Coruna. General Hope's division was positioned on the British left flank, protected by the river Mero. Moore deployed General Baird's division in the centre of the ridge, with the main reserve positioned to the rear and to the right of the ridge. The ground on the right flank consisted of more open terrain, which could provide the French with a flanking opportunity. To guard against this and protect the town, Moore positioned 2 divisions on the far right in further reserve. A stronger position lay to the south on a higher ridge, but Moore felt that he lacked the force to defend it successfully. However, he did place some troops on this ridge in an attempt to slow the French advance. On the 15th of January, the French pushed back these troops and gradually took up position there. A counterattack by the British was repulsed with heavy losses. Soult sighted 11 heavy guns upon the ridge, from where he would be able to fire upon the British right. By the 16th of January, the French were deployed, with Delaborde's division on the right, Merle's division in the centre, and Mamet's division on the left. The bulk of the French cavalry was positioned on the left. Soult's plan was to move against the British left and centre in order to hold it, while Mamet's division attacked the more vulnerable British right. The French cavalry deployed on the left would take advantage of any success by attacking the British right flank to cut off the bulk of their army from the town. The French began their attack at around 2 p.m, with 2 French brigades attacking Baird's front, while a third pushed up the valley on the British right in an attempt to turn their flank. Meanwhile, French dragoons were moving slowly over broken ground, attempting to cover the left of the French advance. The British began to suffer from fire from the French artillery on the ridge opposite. The French captured Elvina and continued their advance to the ridge held by the British. Moore directed the defence and called up the reserve to meet the threat to his right flank. The British advance recaptured Elvina, but some confusion amongst the British allowed Mermet's reserves to recapture the village, chasing the British back up the ridge. Moore called up his reserves of 2 battalions of the Guards, which helped to halt the French advance. Just as he ordered the Guards to advance on Elvina, he was mortally wounded by a cannonball. General Hope now took command, as Baird was also seriously wounded. The second British advance again recaptured Elvina. Mermet now deployed his last reserves, with support from a brigade from Merle's division. This was countered by the advance of an additional supporting British brigade. Fierce fighting ensued, which finally petered out later in the day, with the French withdrawing. The French cavalry on the left attempted a flanking attack, but were impeded by the rough terrain and were driven back by the advance of the British reserves. The French cavalry on the far left were also impeded by the terrain and a British division covering the town's gates, and were forced to withdraw. The night brought an end to the fighting, with both sides finishing in similar positions as they had held before the battle. General Hope decided to continue the embarkation rather than to attempt to hold his ground or attack Soult. At daybreak on the 17th of January, most of the army had embarked. On the 18th of January, the British rearguard embarked. A Spanish garrison held the town citadel until the fleet was well out to sea before surrendering. With the fall of Coruna, the French captured a considerable amount of military stores. As a result of the battle, the British suffered around 900 men dead or wounded. The French lost around 1,000 men killed, wounded or captured. In England and Spain, the reaction to news of the battle and the safe evacuation of the British Army was met with criticism over Moore's handling of the campaign.